Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Leveraging Lessons from the Past webinar. Today's topic is on the Quality Auditor role, assessing the laboratory. This is Heidi Zunker, an Education Program Manager for Mayo Clinic Laboratories. As I introduce our presenters today, I'll have them each wave so that you can put a name to the face. Our presenters today are Lisa Becker, Mindy Berman, and Mary Varenkamp, all audit coordinators in the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. Just a couple of things to remind everyone before we begin today. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the program. You can submit questions online via the Q&A icon on Zoom. Please only use the chat function for any technical issues. Today's program is being recorded and will be posted to our website in a few weeks. And now I'll turn things over to our presenters.
Good morning. So thank you, Heidi, for the introduction. As she stated, Mary Lisa and I are here today to discuss the quality auditor role of assessing the laboratory. Next slide. We have nothing to disclose. Next slide. The objectives for today's presentation are to define the role of an audit coordinator, illustrate internal assessment opportunities to evaluate your laboratory practices, discuss tools and techniques to effectively manage internal assessments. After this presentation today, we hope that you are able to take away some strategies and tools that can be applied to any size laboratory, whether your laboratory has a dedicated resource or not. The Mayo Clinic Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology, or DLMP, is one of the world's largest clinical laboratory and pathology departments. We perform more than 20 million laboratory tests annually. This includes both Mayo Clinic patients who come to Rochester for care and approximately 4,000 Mayo Clinic laboratory clients that submit specimens from around the world to be tested here. We have over 60 clinical laboratories, approximately 4,000 staff in the laboratories. We are accredited by the College of American Pathologists, licensed by the state of New York. Mayo Clinic laboratories operate under multiple regulatory and accreditation models, which can make assessing compliance more challenging. The role of an audit coordinator at a high level is to plan, coordinate, execute, close, and follow up. In each of these little bubbles, you'll see different activities that the audit coordinators support across the Mayo Clinic laboratories. External inspections, we support all activities that are related to planning, coordinating, executing, closure, and follow-up of that external inspection. Checklist and standard review, we coordinate the annual review of updates to the CAP checklist, review of New York State standards when those are updated. The CAP self-inspection, this is a requirement every 2 years, and we will discuss this process in more detail later in the presentation. The CAP peer review inspections, we coordinate all aspects of the preparation and planning with the team leader. We are members of the inspection team, and we ensure all paperwork is complete and submit the documentation to CAP to close out that peer inspection. CAP reaccreditation, we ensure all information is accurate on the cap.org website for our 60+ laboratories that we support. Internal audits, we have a formal program, and it's our responsibility to conduct internal audits of our operations and the quality system. Formal complaints, we write formal letters in response to an investigation from a regulatory or accreditation agency. And formal interpretations, we are a resource for understanding and interpreting requirements. So we operate under the quality system essentials. The audit coordinators fall under the QSE assessment for our activities, which includes internal and external assessments. Today, we're going to focus on internal assessments and specifically the CAP self-inspection, regulatory accreditation review, and the internal audit program. So we're going to kick it off with the CAP self-inspection. So CAP self-inspections, if your lab is CAP accredited, self-inspection is a requirement for the continuation of your accreditation. Beyond it being a requirement, there are benefits for performing a comprehensive self-inspection. Some of those are ongoing compliance with accreditation requirements, a continual state of readiness for an on-site inspection, opportunities to improve your laboratory's performance, and most importantly, providing quality patient care. Findings and recommendations are an opportunity to improve the lab prior to an outside inspection. A self-inspection with no findings is not providing the lab an opportunity to improve. Be harder on yourself than an outside inspector might be. You'd rather find something internally than have an outside inspector find it. Don't make it the goal to not have any findings. The goal is continuous improvement. All right, now we're ready to prepare for self-inspection. What do the audit coordinators do? We create a schedule template that manages the coordination of the inspection. We create an electronic folders for each laboratory in a central location. What we utilize is Microsoft Teams. Within that Microsoft Teams folder for each laboratory, we are going to place a custom checklist that has been downloaded from cap.org. We generate a list of previous findings for each of the laboratories. We create PDF fillable forms for deficiency and recommendations for each checklist, and it's pre-filled with that laboratory name. And we're going to provide those resources to the team leaders along with the deadline for completion of the inspection. Our team leaders are going to identify the members for each inspection team. They're going to include staff at all levels, which could include a laboratory director, technical supervisors, quality staff, testing personnel, non-analytic staff such as LAS, basically anyone that's interested in inspecting. They look for staff that are from a different laboratory or area that have experience in that similar testing or platforms or analytes to be part of that inspection team. Include residents and fellows as either observers or active team members. The participation in an inspection for residents and fellows is a requirement of ACGME accredited programs, so that fulfills that requirement for our residents and fellows. The team leaders are going to encourage all their team members to complete the CAP inspection team member training on cap.org. And the team leaders schedule pre-inspection planning meetings and the inspection date and time. That team leader is going to serve in a role very similar to what a team leader on a peer inspection would. So during that pre-inspection planning meeting, they're going to provide the resources to their team members. They're going to discuss any logistics, such as where are we meeting, reminding them how to manage their time during their inspection. They're going to identify themselves as that resource for any compliance questions or other issues that might come up during inspection. And so this is an example of the schedule template that the audit coordinators create for that coordination of the inspection. So on the left side, you can see that we have the list of laboratories. And then next to that, it shows which checklists apply to that laboratory. We identify that team leader for each lab, who the team members are, the resident and fellow that's assisting, and when that inspection date and time is, and when their prep meeting date and time is. This type of spreadsheet could be created for any size laboratory inspection. So it doesn't have to be this many laboratories. Anybody could use this type of coordination spreadsheet. So now we're ready to get out and inspect the laboratories. So our inspection team is going to review those previous deficiencies that were provided by the audit coordinators. They're going to simulate an on-site inspection as much as possible. They're going to review records, interview staff, observe the lab practices. I'm going to determine the compliance to the applicable checklist questions. I'm going to provide a summation at the end of the inspection to the lab to make sure you discuss any findings and recommendations so you can make sure everybody's on that same page. Questions can be answered before the inspection team leaves the area. And the last thing they're going to do is make sure they complete those deficiency and recommendation fillable forms that were created and provide those to the lab so that everything is wrapped up before the inspection team leaves the laboratory. Very similar to what you would see if you had an on-site inspection, that the team would have a summation session and provide the paperwork to the staff. So we finished our inspection. Now we're ready to wrap it up. Our laboratory quality staff are going to complete a plan of correction for each of the deficiencies. We set a goal to have those plans of correction completed within 30 days from the end of inspection. We understand that not all Process improvements can be completed within 30 days, but we set that goal to try to get these closed as quickly as possible. And what are the audit coordinators doing to close up this inspection? We're completing the self-inspection paperwork that's required to be submitted to CAP. We enter all the findings and recommendations into our internal data collection tool. And we summarize and analyze the data that is generated to create a report. So we'll talk through some different ways you can display your data using some mock data here. So a really nice way to show your year-over-year comparisons. Leadership will ask, well, if we had 50 findings, how does that compare to the previous one? They're only done every 2 years. Nobody can remember how many findings or recommendations we had the last time. So it's really nice to display this in a year-over-year. So we have a chart here that shows a year-over-year, how many deficiencies, how many recommendations, how many labs had no findings. Another way to display your year-over-year comparison is in a table format. Phase 1, how many phase 1 deficiencies, how many phase 2, how many recommendations, how many total, and how does that compare year to year? And another way to display your data would be tables specific to different checklists. So how many deficiencies did you have for each of the checklists that apply to your laboratories? Look at your all common and lab general checklists and list out how many were from there. So those checklists are going to apply to all laboratories across your organization. You can also break it down into checklists with multiple deficiencies. So in this example, I've got 4 findings for Gen 20450. Fill out what the verbiage from the CAP checklist, because nobody looking at your report is going to have that memorized of what Gen 20450 is, and then list out those laboratories that had that finding. It's really important to recognize what your leadership and laboratories are looking for in data to determine what and how to display it. Lots of ways you can make charts and tables, and you can generate a lot of data, but if it's not what anybody's looking for, it's just a lot of work for you to create something that people aren't interested in. So focus on what your leadership and your laboratories are asking you in that summation to know how to display your data. So now you have your data. What are you going to do with your data? So a review of your findings and looking at anything that might be high risk to patient care. Do you have findings across several laboratories? Are you seeing repeat findings? So thinking about all of those things and what your findings are, perform an analysis for the root cause or common themes, especially when you have several laboratories with the same finding or you have repeat findings. Once you've determined if there's a root cause or a common theme, then you can look at what kind of follow-up action can be performed to close the gap identified. A couple of examples that created here, policy and procedure manual. So you had multiple findings across that. You look at what the objective evidence is, and you determine that it's specific to job aids. So then you think about what kind of follow-up action can you do. Maybe you want to perform an internal audit and get in the lab and look at those job aids. Correction of laboratory records, multiple findings there. You look at the objective evidence and you say, you know what, these are all very isolated incidents. There's no common themes. So what kind of action can you do? Maybe you just want to provide training to the specific laboratory or personnel that's involved. PPE provision and usage. Maybe you have repeat findings related to PPE. You look at that objective evidence and you determine that it's staff not wearing the appropriate PPE. What kind of follow-up action can you do? Maybe you share that with your leadership or a safety officer if you have one. Determine what kind of action can be put in place across all of your laboratories. And finally, we create an executive summary report that we review with leadership. The report includes, what the inspection was, when it happened, the scope, which laboratories were included in the inspection, a brief summary. We list out how many people were involved, how many deficiencies, how many recommendations, how many labs didn't have any deficiencies or recommendations. We put in those charts and tables that were created with our data, and we provide that analysis and action plan for the findings. And I'll pass it off to Lisa to take us through regulatory and accreditation review.
So no surprise, but it is critical that the laboratory remain up to date on regulatory and accreditation requirements, especially when there are changes that occur. As a quality auditor, we facilitate the review of regulatory and accreditation requirements to ensure both compliance being maintained, but also met if it is a new requirement. We initiate a review anytime there is a change identified. This includes a new version of a checklist or standard, or if there's a change in regulations. To facilitate the review, we found it helpful to provide the reviewers with everything they need, essentially a one-stop shop. And we do this by using email templates. This provides laboratory staff with consistent communication and clear expectations. Shown here is an example of an email template that we have created and use when we initiate a review, such as a CAP checklist review, which is what this example shows. The template provides the scope of the review, step-by-step instructions, links to helpful or required resources, and deadlines. We also provide instructions as to who the information should be shared with. Visuals such as the timeline shown at the bottom of the template are very helpful when you're talking due dates and there's potentially multiple due dates to keep track of, and the due dates may apply to different pieces or individuals. One lesson that we have learned as audit coordinators is when communicating via email, it is important to keep the email concise and only include the necessary information. Lengthy emails with extraneous or additional information can sometimes result in the reader missing key pieces of information. Using the same CAP checklist review that we noted and talked about in the previous slide as our example, communication is sent to our laboratory sections, and in this case, they were to review the all common, laboratory general, and any discipline-specific checklists. The laboratory sections are then instructed to complete a PDF fillable form, which an example is shown here. And this documents any gaps or deficiencies found. The laboratory is used to this approach. They see this form every time there is a review initiated. It provides them with instructions as well as any links needed for them to complete the entirety of the task, in this case, documenting any deficiencies and creating those plans of correction. If there are no gaps or deficiencies identified, we do ask that each laboratory section still complete this form and just check the box stating no deficiencies or gaps were identified. And the reason for this is it closes the loop and lets us know that the review has been completed and is no longer pending. As with the email templates, the PDF fillable forms provide a consistent communication approach to the laboratory staff, and similar to the templates, it also includes those instructions and links that are key to the task at hand. Regulatory and accreditation review is also performed on those requirements that apply to all of the laboratory sections and maybe more overarching items such as requirements surrounding safety or the quality system. As with the individual ones, it's important for these to also be reviewed to ensure compliance. As part of the review process, an annotated response is created for each of these overarching requirements. So the first question you often get is, what is an annotated response? It's an interpretation, and it assists with understanding the meaning of the standard or checklist. And most importantly, it identifies how the laboratory is meeting the requirement. The audit coordinator role facilitates the review of each of these requirements as well as the annotated response. We do not know all of the information, so therefore we rely on subject matter experts to help create the responses and ensure that they are accurate. Currently, we have annotated responses created for regulatory and accreditation requirements, such as CAP's Lab General, All Common, and Director Assessment checklists, as well as New York State's General Systems Standards. We utilize SharePoint and have created a site that serves as an in-house tool. There are vendor tools that may be available, but the bonus is it ensures the annotated responses are accessible to all laboratory staff at any location they may be at. All they need is a computer to be able to access them. Shown here is a screenshot of our SharePoint tool. And this shows, for example, annotated responses for CAP's Lab General checklist. A few things to really point out and note is each requirement is listed on a separate line. and they are categorized the same way CAP categorizes them. So they are lumped based on quality management system or safety, or those specific items that CAP categorizes each checklist. Each requirement is shown in its entirety, and from year to year, we're able to identify whether the requirement has changed from the previous version, and almost more importantly, what is the change? So you will see on the far right of this screenshot, it states CAP changes, and I'll show you in the next slide what that looks like, but we're able to actually see what the change is. Another thing that's new to our most recent update is CAP utilized an icon in their checklist to show whether a policy or procedure is required to meet a checklist item. We have added that into our annotated responses tool, so we are able to show that same icon to indicate that a policy or procedure is needed to meet this requirement. And although not shown in the screenshot to the far right, we are able to assign and show who is assigned as that subject matter expert for that particular checklist requirement. Each of those previous items were clickable, and if we were to click on any one of them, this is what would show up. So for example, this is on personnel qualifications, and the subject matter expert assigned to the requirement, as you can see with the first red arrow on the left, is listed, and this happens to be me. So we can list multiple subject matter experts, and they are allowed to collaborate, add comments and such when they're reviewing it. Another important feature is right below that is it states a status. We are able to state complete, meaning we have reviewed the changes and we have appropriately added or created or modified an annotated response to show we meet this requirement. However, if the change is something where maybe we have a gap identified, we can flag it in this system to state action is needed. And this is extremely helpful for us to keep track of where our potential gaps still are that we need to be working on. Additionally, CAP, when we upload these into our tool, it will state if CAP has revised this checklist requirement, maybe it's a new one. And additionally, in the next screenshot, you will see what exactly are those changes. And this was where I was showing kind of just a little snippet previously. This is where you can see that full change. And it has track changes on, so you can see exactly what was added, what was removed, and it makes it really easy to understand exactly what that change is. The most important piece of this annotated response is the fact that we can include links or any information needed for the laboratory to show how they would meet the requirement listed, and that's extremely helpful for the laboratories. The final piece of regulatory accreditation review is for the audit coordinator to summarize the gaps and deficiencies identified, specifically to determine, are there any common themes or gap areas identified from all of the laboratory sections, each of them reviewed all common, each of them reviewed lab general. Many of them have the same discipline-specific checklists. And so are there any common themes identified, or is it something that's more laboratory section specific? As the quality auditor, it's our role to identify those common themes and evaluate, is there additional work needed, potentially as Mindy discussed in a future internal audit, or is there additional training needed, potentially depending on what was identified. Finally, we present these gaps and findings to all of the laboratory sections and their staff, as it provides a crucial communication piece. It kind of closes out the review for one, but it also highlights areas that they may be missed or may highlight an area that was notified or noticed in many areas that maybe is a high priority item for them to take a look at in their own laboratory area. So it's really nice. It kind of highlights things, and it's a sharing, more of a collaboration. Next, I will turn it over to Mary.
Thanks, Lisa. So the final internal assessment that we will be discussing with you this morning is an internal audit program. So of course we begin with a couple definitions. The first one came from ISO, and they call an audit a systematic, independent, and documented process for obtaining evidence and evaluating it objectively to determine the extent to which required criteria are fulfilled. I particularly like the second bullet item because it's so concise. It simply states, auditing may be thought of as the process of comparing reality with requirements. So the million-dollar question is, well, why do we conduct internal audits? For several reasons. They provide an opportunity to know, are we doing what we say we do? So the labs have stated what they do via their policies and procedures. And how do they prove that? It's with the records. So are we doing what we say we do and prove it via the records that we retain? Systemic issues. Determining, is something really an isolated incident, or is it impacting multiple laboratories? The next two bullets, obviously, we want to be prepared. And wouldn't it be better if we found our gaps prior to an external agency finding them, as Mindy alluded to during the self-inspection? And of course, continuous improvement. What can we learn and how can we do better? So because here at Mayo Clinic, we operate under a quality management system, which includes the 12 quality system essentials, we can look within our quality system and it will provide us the areas to focus on for our internal audit program. We don't have to dream something up. We look within our program and the results that we are getting, and they should point us in the right direction of what areas to conduct internal audits. So let's look at a couple of them. For example, assessments. Proficiency testing. Why do we do internal audits on proficiency testing? Well, it's definitely a high-risk area. Anything that we as audit coordinators can do to provide an independent review of compliance for our proficiency testing provides value to our laboratories. Internal and external assessment findings. Here is where, whether you're doing an internal audit, a CAP self-inspection, or you've just been inspected by an external agency, you need to look at the data. You need to analyze the data. Are we having repeat deficiencies? Is this an isolated incident or systemic issues? And that will lead you to perhaps areas where you want to conduct an internal audit. Process management. We did an internal audit on individualized quality control plans. Why did we do that? Well, back in 2015, 2016, there was a new requirement that came out, and labs were required, when it was applicable, to have an IQCP in place. And with that requirement came new forms needed to be completed. And so here was an opportunity for us as audit coordinators, after the labs have had time to implement this process, to go into the laboratories and see, are we in compliance with this new requirement? So what should I audit as you look at your quality management system? Previous findings and from inspections. Maybe you have management staff that make a request to do an internal audit, or it could come from your laboratories. Maybe there's a process change that has happened. You're changing the way you're doing something, and you would like an internal audit to see if you're still in compliance. New requirements, as I just alluded to the IQCP. Risk, as I talked about with proficiency testing. Or you're monitoring metric data, your key performance indicators. And maybe you're not heading in the right direction. You're seeing some trends or shifts or patterns, and that would benefit from having an internal audit. So look within your quality management system, look at areas of new requirements, risk, previous findings, and that will really guide you to what internal audits to perform. This is a picture of our audit schedule, and it's not very complicated. It's pretty simplistic. What we do is we determine our areas of focus, what audits we plan to conduct, and we tie those to a quality system essential. And this schedule is completed November of December of the year prior, and it is reviewed with our leadership. We then publish this schedule to our internal website. And we not only include internal audits on this schedule, but if we know that we are having our on-site inspection or anticipate an on-site inspection happening during that year, we will also include that because it will impact how many internal audits the audit coordinators can do during that year based upon other inspections that will also be happening during the same time. This is a high-level overview of our internal audit process, and I will go into more detail in the next few slides for some of these elements. But it all starts with an audit plan. And once you are thinking about your audit plan, you're thinking about your approach. Do I need some checklists that will guide me and keep me organized as I do this audit? Am I going to be looking at a sampling of the information, or will I be looking at all the data? I'm going to then, as my audit plan is ready, I'll perform the audit, of course, and at that time, I'll gather my objective evidence as we have outlined in our audit plan. We assess the evidence to the requirements, and we make objective opinions on whether or not the requirements were whether or not the evidence was in compliance. We always provide a preliminary report to the auditees, to the areas, the laboratories that we have audited. We feel that this is important because we don't want any surprises. We want to give our laboratories the opportunity to discuss the report prior to the final report being issued. We want them to have the ability to answer questions and clarify information within the report that they may not understand. Once that is complete, we'll issue a final report, and that report is obviously given to the auditees who participated, and our department leadership also gets a copy of the report. We also have a quality oversight subcommittee that reviews and receives copies of these audit reports. As with the CAP self-inspection that Mindy talked about, we treat deficiencies and findings from an internal audit just as we would for an on-site inspection from an external agency. Plan of corrections are required, and they must be completed within 30 days. It doesn't mean all actions have to be completed, but you at least must have a plan and are working on it. And then we have the ability to monitor these findings for closure via our internal database, which we'll discuss as well. So let's look at a little detail of what our audit template looks like for our audit plan. This is the very beginning when you start putting your thoughts together on the audit that you're going to do. Intent of the audit is the purpose. It can be something as simple as the intent of this audit is to determine compliance with, and then you fill in the blanks. Scope is very important. What is your inclusion and your exclusion criteria? What will or will not be assessed? And it really sets the boundaries for what will be included in the audit. The method can be various things. Will you as an audit coordinator be going directly into the laboratory and observing staff and interviewing staff? Is it a desk audit where you're requesting records from the laboratory and reviewing those records for compliance? And many of you may have heard of that term specimen tracer audit. It is a technique used by the Joint Commissions when they come on site for our inpatient and outpatient practice. They are following a patient throughout the standard of care at our organization. And in a laboratory environment, this is a technique that New York State will use when they come on site and inspect our laboratories. They are also following a patient, but that patient is assigned an order number and a session number and is tied to a particular test. So they are walking through that entire path of that test from the time it was ordered pre-analytically to the work that was done in the lab, as well as the post-analytic process. So they're looking at that patient's order number throughout the path of workflow. And it's a very, very thorough technique. It can cover a lot of requirements in this technique. Obviously, in our audit plan, we list the requirements that we are going to audit against. And it's not just external requirements. We have our own laboratory-specific requirements, policies, procedures that we must also take into consideration to determine compliance. And obviously, the requirements drive our assessment of compliance. And lastly, evidence of compliance we include in our audit plan. We find this very useful because it defines the specific documents and records that will be reviewed. It drives consistency among the audit coordinators, and it helps prevent what we call that scope creep. So we're not asking for things, we're not reviewing information that was not in scope for the audit. So let's go through a few examples of what I mean by approach. And when I reference, do I need a checklist? Should I develop a checklist when I'm doing this internal audit? So this is an example of a checklist that we developed when we did an internal audit on quality management planning and continuous improvement. You will see on the left, what are the questions that we asked? We have a section for documenting results. Our reference column will list all the agencies from New York State to CAP, as well as internal requirements that are being assessed for this question, and then an area for comments. And so, as letter B states, you will go into the lab and you will ask, can you describe for me the metrics that you have in place to monitor across the path of workflow? So I would expect the laboratory to share with me what metrics they are monitoring in the pre-analytic phase, the analytic phase, and the post-analytic phase. And follow up to that question, I would then ask, once I looked at their charts and graphs, what are your goals? What goals have you set? Or how did you benchmark? And what do you do if you don't meet your goals? So this lays out an organized approach to conduct an internal audit, and it's very helpful for consistency and preparation. Here's another tool, another checklist. And not all tools or checklists that we create are just for the audit coordinators. This is one that we provide to our laboratory staff and ask them to complete. And provide the instructions at the top. And what we have requested our laboratories to do is when you do a reagent labeling audit, we want you to select 5 reagents from various locations in the laboratory. Workbenches, workstations, instruments, refrigerators, freezers, those reagents that are at room temperature. And we list on the left-hand side the required elements that need to be on that label for that reagent. And then we ask our laboratories to assess their reagents. Are they meeting the labeling requirements? And so across the various elements, they can document if it was present or absent. And this is a great opportunity to involve all laboratory staff in the internal audit process. It really helps to reinforce to them with them why reagent labeling is important and what the requirements are. And they will in turn provide this information back to the audit coordinators so we can document the information and share it as well. Another checklist that we use in internal audits, to give you an example, this we call our audit question bank for safety audits. This is a 9-page document that covers all areas of safety, and it's done annually, and it includes both questions as well as observations when you go into a laboratory to assess safety. So for example, one of the questions is, are laboratory benches, floors, and storage areas neat and orderly? And so it will list the corresponding requirement on the far right. Another interview question you may want to ask staff when you're in the lab. What are the acronyms for RACE and PASS in response to a fire? Or can you tell me the number you would call in case of an emergency on a Mayo Clinic phone? So the intent obviously is to keep our staff and our organization safe. We want to make sure that we are in compliance with OSHA requirements, New York State, CAP, and everything that goes along with safety practices. So, okay, we've done internal audits for several years, and we always have to look back and say, what have we learned in this process? We learned something during the COVID pandemic. We live in an electronic environment. We use a vended document management system, so all of the audit coordinators have access to all the laboratories, policies, processes, procedures, forms. They're all electronic. So I don't necessarily have to physically be in the lab to review records. I can do that electronically because not only are those documents in the document management system that we have, but a majority of the records that our labs retain are also kept electronically. So because of that electronic environment, I don't need to have to go into the lab and look at records. I can do that remotely. And what we have done is created a process using Microsoft Teams for obtaining these laboratory records. We will create folders in Microsoft Teams, and based upon the audit that we're doing, we will ask the labs to place the specified records we're requesting in the designated folders. An advantage of this is it's less intrusive to the labs. They can drop these records and files into the folders when they have time. And it has worked very, very well for both the audit coordinators and the laboratories. What else have we learned? Be very specific. Clear instructions are very beneficial, not only to the auditors, but to the lab staff. It creates efficiency, so you don't have to go back and request additional records. Look for opportunities to review multiple requirements. So what do I mean by that? When you develop your audit plan and you decide what records you want to review, that is the time when you can determine if by asking for that specific record, would there be an opportunity to look at other things on that record that also have specific requirements? So I'll give you an example. We did an audit on ungraded PT challenges. And the intent of that audit was to look at how the lab determines the acceptability of ungraded PT results and how they document this on the evaluation report. So as long as we are asking the lab for the PT evaluation report, there is also information there that we could also assess. One of our agencies that inspects us requires a certain timeline that these reviews have to occur. That's something we could also look at. In addition, as we're looking at the evaluation report, there may be an unacceptable PT performance. That's an opportunity for us to review the investigation and corrective action. So think about how you can really look at multiple requirements on a single document. And of course, be very respectful of lab time and our staff. Our lab staff is very busy. We know that they are stressed, short-staffed. We want to be very respectful and at least as little intrusive as we can be and avoid any peak workload times when we conduct internal audits. Some other things that we've learned: ask what went well and what didn't, so we can continuously improve our audit experience. We want to change what we're doing when we do internal audits if it's not working. One of the example I can give you is related to the CAP self-inspection. The audit coordinators did some pretty large process changes for our CAP self-inspection, and at the completion of that, we wanted to get feedback from all the staff that participated. So we did a red cap survey, And we gained some very valuable information from that on things that we could tweak, things that we could change, or very positive comments on the experience. Don't do an internal audit just so you can check something off the list and say you did it. Make sure that when you spend the time and resources to do an internal audit, it provides value and will benefit the organization and the laboratory. A deficiency in one lab does not mean you don't have the same issue in multiple laboratories. So during an inspection, if one lab was cited for a deficiency, a particular deficiency, we often think, okay, when that lab corrects it, it's fixed, we're done, it's over. But how many other labs had the same issue, but it just wasn't identified by the inspector? So it's important to share this information with other labs so they can learn and examine their own practices. And of course, tools. Tools create efficiency, not only for our lab staff, but they're very beneficial as an audit coordinator. So that's what we'll talk about next. We mentioned this internal database, and I want to talk a little bit about that. It's called Quality Center. We cannot be paper-based when we have such a large organization that we do. And even if you're not large, you can't be pushing paper around, looking through boxes to try to answer questions or analyze data. You've probably been asked, how many times have we been cited for this requirement in the past 3 on-site inspections? Or how did we compare this year to last year? It's not easy to answer those questions if you're paper-based. You need a system. You need a database of some kind to retain all your historical information and a mechanism to analyze that data. And the system that we use is called Quality Center. It's a web-based application. The way we came across this database is that it was used by our IT department for software testing, but they have now moved on to another application. However, we work with IT and still use this database to customize it so it can be used for our needs. And we're fortunate enough to have an IT administrator that will support the tool when we need modifications. So what does this tool do for us? It is our repository for all things audit. Anything the audit coordinators are involved in all the assessments that we just got done talking about, from regulatory accreditation reviews, self-inspections, internal audits, as well as our external inspections, all reside within this tool. It has search functionality, sorting functionality, and it is very beneficial that we can export this data to Excel so we can slice and dice the information and understand what it's telling us. We have status fields so we can monitor findings for closure and follow-up. And it's a centralized source for documentation. We can upload and attach all records to this tool. So those paper pinks and yellow sheets you get from CAP with a handwritten writing from the inspector, we scan those and we attach them within the tool. All the audit reports we write are in the tool. All the laboratory plans of corrections, the laboratories will upload their plan of corrections in the tool. So everything is in a centralized place. And it certainly makes life a lot easier for everybody. I just wanted to quickly mention PDF fillable forms again. This is another tool that you could use to do an internal audit. Lisa talked about this when we talked about our checklist reviews or our New York State standard reviews, and asking the lab to identify gaps when we have new versions or new requirements. Well, it's the same PDF fillable form ideas that we can use in internal audits. We identify what information we need from the lab. The labs document that information on this form, and then all they do is click a send button, and the audit coordinators get that information back. This happens to be an example for a proficiency testing assessment. We, the audit coordinators, identified the survey that we were interested in gathering the information from. We indicated that on the form. The lab fills out the rest of it and sends it back to us. So lastly, to summarize kind of all the internal assessments that we've talked about and the tools that might assist you in supporting your activities. Obviously, SharePoint has been a great help to us, a way for us to document our annotated responses, a way for us to manage new requirements, our templates that we use from our audit plan template for internal audits, our self-inspection executive summaries. Lisa talked about those emails, keeping all those drafts and just tweaking them so you have consistent instructions and you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. Spreadsheets are critical to us because we collect a lot of data and we have to make sense of that data and we have to share that data. Self-inspections, we use spreadsheets to organize and manage that process, as Mindy shared with you. Our checklists, we talked about the safety checklists that we use, those checklists that we built for some of our internal audits. I just mentioned the PDF fillable forms, and of course, just talked about Quality Center as an internal database that we use to keep all of our information. So as Mindy stated, don't feel that these tools are not available to you. It doesn't just matter or fit for a large organization like the Mayo Clinic. They can be used by any laboratory organization, no matter what size, to help you manage the assessments that you do with your laboratories. So that concludes our presentation this morning. I want to thank you so much for joining us. I'll now turn it back over to Heidi.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks to Lisa and Mindy as well. At this time, we would like to take any questions that you may have. You may submit your questions through the Q&A icon in Zoom.
All right, it looks like we're getting some questions, and I'll try to address a few of these that are coming in. One of them are, can you share some of your tools? Certainly document your interest on what you're curious about or something you'd like shared when you conduct your survey. And Heidi and her team can share that information with us at a later time. How many QA staff? That's a great question. We are fortunate here at Mayo Clinic to work at an organization that really where quality is very, very important, and they provide us the resources for that. We have a quality management unit, and within that unit, we have what we call quality management coordinators. There are about, I would say, 7 of them that oversee each individual laboratory. And as Mindy mentioned, we have over 60. We also have quality individuals within the lab who have responsibilities. They often work at the bench, but they also have quality duties. So I can't give you a number, but we have different roles across our organization. Is the database you have self-developed or purchased? Quality Center was a vended system. So what we did is it was intended for IT as a test management tool, but we worked with them to kind of customize it so we can use it for audit purposes. As I indicated, IT no longer uses that tool, but they continue to support us, which is great. Do you recommend both SharePoint and Quality Center? I would say that if you want to develop a database internally for yourself, there's no reason why that database couldn't be a repository for your audit information, as well as a repository for your annotated responses. We happen to separate them at one point, sometime in the future. Maybe we will look at combining everything. Maybe we won't need to separate these things. But for now, they are separated, but you could certainly combine them. Will the slides follow after the meeting? There's a lot of information you shared. Thank you so much. We appreciate that. Certainly hope you gained something from our presentation that will help you. And I do believe, Heidi, that these slides will be shared. All right. And it looks like we have one question. What EMR does Mayo use? Mayo uses for electronic medical record for inpatients, we use Epic. Epic is our EMR.
Well,
and
thank you.
Don't believe there's any additional questions.
Yeah, it looks like you got through them all. Thanks, Mary. Just as a reminder, laboratory credit is extended for the program, and upon finalizing your evaluation, you'll have the option to claim credit and print your certificate. As a reminder, this program was recorded and will be archived on our website in a few weeks. Thank you again for joining us for today's webinar and have a great day.